Hello students, welcome to this another discussion video. Our topic is about retained earnings, specifically about the appropriation and quasi reorganization. So let us first discuss what a retained earnings is. So retained earnings represent the cumulative profits and losses which are retained or plowed back, no, and not yet distributed as dividends to the shareholders. So there are two types of retained earnings. So it could be an appropriated retained earnings. So that's a portion which is free and can be declared as dividends to stockholders. And the other one is appropriated retained earnings. So that represent the portion which is restricted and is not allowed, not available for any dividend declaration unless the restriction is subsequently reversed. So when a corporation issues or declares dividends, most probably it's coming from the unappropriated or the free portion of the retained earnings. So there are different types of appropriation. What's the rationale or what's the reason why the corporation will appropriate or restrict a certain amount of its retained earnings? So basically, the reason is that they don't want, because they have some things in mind, so they don't want to declare or they don't want to distribute that portion of the retained earnings that they are trying to um, allocate into some things that they have in mind. So here are the types of appropriation, and um, why these corporations are uh, doing this restriction or appropriation of retained earnings. So first is yung legal appropriation. So these appropriations are required by law, as in the case of treasury share. So for example, if the corporation purchased back their shares which were previously issued, they are obliged, required by law, to restrict, or appropriate the same amount, equivalent to the cost of the treasury shares from the retained earnings. So retained earnings must be appropriated to the extent of the cost of the treasury shares as mentioned. So kung magkano yung cost ng treasury share, ito rin yung dapat or yung total amount na dapat na-restrict, sa dividend, sa retained earnings rather. Second is yung contractual appropriation. So itong type of appropriation na to, this is appropriations required by contract. So such as appropriation for bond or preference share redemption, because there are times for more protection to the investors, or for example to the bondholders or the preference shareholders. So mas gusto nila yung secured sila, in the sense na may nilaan talaga for them, so that pagdating ng time na i-redeem na yung bond or yung preference share, meron talagang um, nakalaan, so hindi magpo-problema yung corporation na i-pay off sila because they have restricted portion of their earnings already to pay off the bond or preference share. So hindi nila masasauli or hindi nila ma-declare yun as part of the dividends. So yan. Another is voluntary appropriation. So it is just a matter of discretion on the part of the management. So depende na lang kung ano yung plano ng management. So sila mismo yung nag-decide na mag-allocate ng portion of the retained earnings na ipa-plowback na. Hindi na muna nila i-declare as dividends, but they're saving up or they're strengthening it or they're restricting it for something. So, example niyan, so if they have plans for plant expansion or if they want to appropriate for contingencies, na say for example, they are facing lawsuit and they don't know yet what will be the outcome. So they don't want to give out all of their dividends and then eventually meron pala silang expense no na mai-incur because of that lawsuit. So pwedeng gano'n, no? They will appropriate for mga contingencies that they have in mind. So yan, voluntary yan na appropriation. Now, whether it's legal, contractual, or voluntary, the intent or purpose of the appropriation of the retained earnings is to limit the declaration of dividend. So funding is different concept from appropriation. So funding will denote cash. No? So you're setting aside cash. Here, appropriation is different. So you're just trying to restrict part of your retained earnings so that you will be warned or the corporation will know that this amount cannot be declared as dividends. So for example, yung inappropriatan nila, inatapos na, like for example, yung plant expansion, okay na, natayo na nila yung plant no na um, gusto nilang itayo, then most probably ibalik na sa unappropriated fund yung or unappropriated retained earnings yung amount na ni-restrict nila. So the appropriation of retained earnings is just very simple, no? So because pag mag-appropriate tayo or mag-restrict tayo ng retained earnings, all you have to do is just reclassify it. So what happened is that tatanggalin lang natin no, yung amount na yun sa retained earnings na unappropriated and then i-transfer natin sa retained earning appropriated, na retained earnings appropriated. So it's just a matter of reclassifying the amount as restricted or appropriated. So if ever na hindi na or wala na or tapos na yung pinag-restrictan, so i-reverse lang din natin yung entry na to. So take note no that appropriations of retained earnings do not affect the total shareholders' equity as well as the total retained earnings, since both types of retained earnings comprise the total retained earnings. So it's just a matter of transferring one amount or certain amount from one account under the equity section and then just transfer it to another account which is still under the equity section of your statement of financial position. So in effect, wala talaga siyang effect in terms of total, no? Zero effect in terms of total na shareholders' equity. We're just moving amounts from one account to the other, which are still under the same section of your statement of financial position. Okay. Now, what about this one? Negative balances in equity. Usually, retained earnings na yung normal balance niya ay credit. No, that represents, of course, na if that's credit, meaning meron ka accumulated profits from your previous operations. So when the retained earnings account has a debit balance, so it is called a deficit. So this is represented as a deduction from the total shareholders' equity. So others will term this as accumulated losses na siya. So kulang, no? You have a deficit if your retained earnings has a debit balance kasi normally it will have a credit balance. So the total she has a negative balance. It is described as capital deficiency. And then we have here items directly affecting retained earnings. I think all of these items here has been discussed already in the previous video about retained earnings. So those items that are affecting retained earnings, like for example, your net income can actually increase your retained earnings. Prior period errors, these are those errors discovered just recently, in the current period, yet they were committed in the previous years, and previous years were already closed. No, so if that error has something to do with an income account or an expense account, then you have to charge that or credit that to retained earnings, depende So if that particular error has caused understatement to your earnings na in the prior year, meaning you have to credit your retained earnings. If yung error naman na yun ay nakakause ng overstatement naman ng income in the prior periods, then you have to debit the retained earnings para makorek natin yung error, no? So whatever was or whatever adjustment that you'll have, no, in your net income in the prior years, so that will be coursed through your retained earnings, because as I always say, retained earnings becomes your window to the past, no? Kasi lahat ng income natin actually, no, yung mga temporary accounts natin, no, like income and expense accounts were closed to retained earnings na in a corporate setup. And then number 3, dividends to shareholders. So that one will, of course, na related lang sa unappropriated na retained earnings. And then it will reduce our retained earnings eventually if there is a dividend declaration. Then 4th is the effect of change in accounting policy. So again, pag change in accounting policy, that should be taken into consideration. It should be effective retrospectively, or the application of that should be retrospective, meaning you have to restate, no, whatever was reported in the past, and that will be coursed through also your retained earnings. And then we have appropriation of retained earnings. So basically, we're talking about unappropriated retained earnings here. So that's why kasama yung appropriation of retained earnings na sa mga items na naka-apekto ng retained earnings. Kasi basically, if you appropriated something, no, or if there's an appropriation, then it will reduce your unappropriated retained earnings. Some components of OCI that are subsequently reclassified to retained earnings. So may mga items tayo, like for example, our revaluation surplus, na kapag na-realize mo na, no, meron tayong tinatawag na piecemeal realization for depreciable assets, no? So pag yung asset ay nagamit mo na, no, or naka-depreciate ka na, at the same time din yung revaluation surplus ay dapat realize na natin, i-recognize na natin, transfer natin yung portion to retained earnings. So, for non-depreciable naman, of course, yung revaluation surplus ng mga non-depreciable assets. So, once they're sold already, no, nang na-revalue mo na asset tapos na benta mo, so yung related na revaluation surplus dapat transfer mo na sa retained earnings. Another is retirement of treasury shares. So this is when the cost of the treasury share exceeds par value of shares to when retired. I mean, if the par value of shares retired exceeds when the cost of the treasury share exceeds its par value, no? So yan. So parang may loss, and yung parang loss niya, charge natin the retained earnings. Recognition of share issuance cost if share premium is not enough. So take note, yung mga cost incurred natin in relation to issuing the shares. So take note, diba, na hindi natin siya i-recognize as expense, but rather charge natin sa share premium. So pag hindi enough yung share premium, dun mo ito-charge siya sa retained earnings. So call of preference shares if the call price exceeds the original issue price. So parang meron tayong loss dito. So that's why we're going to charge it a retained earnings. And then conversion of preference shares into ordinary shares if the total par value of the ordinary share issued exceeds the original issue price of the preference share. So para rin ganun, no? Meron tayong somehow loss. So which will be debited na to your retained earnings account. So ito yung mga items na directly nakaka-apekto sa ating retained earnings. So we have here a pro forma computation, no, kung paano mag-compute ng unappropriated retained earnings at the end. So of course, considering all of the items that could affect our retained earnings. So starting with the beginning balance, and then plus minus your retrospective restatement of the prior period errors, plus minus, no, the retrospective application that change in accounting policy. So, depende na lang yan kung yung change ba or yung prior period error ba ay naka-increase or naka-understate ba ng net income before or naka-overstate ba ng net income before. And then you add your net income or deduct your net loss for the current period. You deduct the dividends declared during the period, and then movements in appropriation. So it could be addition or deduction because kung restriction siya, so from the first time ni inappropriate mo yung certain amount, so it will reduce your inappropriated retained earnings. But then there are also cases na binalik mo na lang, no, sa unappropriated retained earnings kasi tapos na yung like for example, yung plant expansion tapos na. So yung ginawa mo na lang ay ibalik natin sa unappropriated na retained earnings. So, yun yung total natin. So, next will be reserves. No? Reserves form part of the equity of an entity. But take note, the term reserve is not really officially defined in the accounting standards or the conceptual framework. So, under IAS, the use of equity reserve is based on whether it is part of distributable equity or non-distributable equity, no? Hindi talaga siya, or kung titingnan natin sa mga statement of financial position, specifically the equity section, hindi mo talaga makikita yung reserve. Kasi yung term na yan ay hindi talaga defined, no, sa accounting standard. So, yun lang. Ano ba yung distributable? Ano yung non-distributable equities? Pag sinabing distributable equity, ito yung portion na pwede nating i-declare as dividends. Pero pag non-distributable, ito yung mga items na under the equity section na bawal isauli sa mga shareholders during their lifetime. Because take note, corporations are bound to follow what you call a trust fund doctrine. No, hindi pwedeng isauli ang capital, no, sa mga shareholders during the lifetime of the corporation. So specifically, ang sinabi ay legal capital. So bawal isauli sa mga shareholders ang legal capital during the lifetime of the corporation. That is to protect, no, the interest of the creditors, considering that corporation, in a corporate setup, the shareholder has limited liability, or shareholders actually have limited liability. So kung ano lang yung kinontribute nila sa corporation, yun lang din yung kanilang liability or pananagutan, no, sa mga creditors. So pag nag-file ng bankruptcy yung corporation, so yung malulugi lang or mawawala lang sa shareholders are only those amounts na kinontribute nila, yung investment mismo nila, no? So hindi na bale ma-run after yung personal assets ng shareholders in case na mag-bankrupt siya. So because of that, no? So kaya meron tayong trust fund doctrine to protect also the interest of the lenders or the creditors of the corporation. So ano yung mga non-distributable equity reserves? So meron tayong share premium reserve, no? Bawal yan i-distribute as dividends kasi most probably share premium or the excess of the amount, no, the issue price of the share over the par value or stated value at that can be actually considered as legal capital. That's in the case of a no par value share. So appropriation reserve, asset revaluation reserve or revaluation surplus, yan. And other comprehensive income reserve, no? So specifically yung other OCI, or I mean components of the OCI. So I know that you are familiar to some of this, no, because you already encounter this in your previous na mga topics din in intermediate accounting. Like for example, yung letter A and letter B, these are actually related to our topics sa investment. Now, when you recognize unrealized gain or unrealized loss in the equity security that you are accounting for is designated at fair value through OCI, no? So yan, yung mga changes niyan, mapupunta siya sa OCI. As well as equity as well as debt investment. And the letter C, this one is related to a higher accounting na topic, yung mga translation ng financial statements of a foreign operation. So ito, it has something to do with foreign exchange, no? Na yung financial statements sa isang branch na ng company na like for example, Jollibee has different branches already. Example lang, no? If that particular branch sa Jollibee kintahay na sa Dubai, so if the parent company is in the Philippines and then there's a branch in Dubai, so dapat yung financial statements ng branch sa Dubai ay ita-translate siya sa Philippine peso para ma-integrate and ma-consolidate dito sa financial statements ng you can consolidate because hindi mo naman pwedeng ma-consolidate kapag iba-iba yung denomination. So what you have to do is you have to translate it first, no? And then translation would either result to a gain or loss. Kasi nga merong fluctuations, no, sa ating may fluctuations siya sa foreign exchange rates. So iba-iba yan. And there's a process to do that which will be taken up in your higher accounting. Then letter D, change in revaluation surplus. Na if in case merong addition or merong reduction, no, sa related sa revaluation. And then we have unrealized gain or loss from derivative contracts designated as cash flow hedge. So this one also is taken in other subject pa. Then remeasurement of defined benefit plan. So this one you cannot relate yet because it's related to retirement, or this is related to post-employment benefits. So sa next na subject na lang ito cover, but you just have to take note that it's part of this is one of the components of your other comprehensive income. And then we have change in fair value attributable to the credit risk of a financial liability irrevocably designated at fair value through profit and loss. So this one lang letter G na yan, discuss na yan, if I'm not mistaken, sa receivable na topic. Or sa notes payable na topic. No? So, parang ganun. So, next would be yung statement of changes in equity. No? This is a formal statement that shows the movement or movements in the elements or components of the shareholders' equity. So, take note, class, diba? Unlike a sole proprietorship or a partnership, sa shareholders equity, ang daming components na meron kang yung contributed capital, meron kang retained earnings, no? So yan, may iba-iba pang mga accounts, no? Like may share premium, as in marami siyang components. So that's why, itong statement of changes in equity, it will let us know what happened to these accounts in a particular year. So, ano yung mga nasa statement of changes in equity? So your total comprehensive income for the period, and for each component of equity, no, the effects of changes in accounting policy or correction of error kung meron man, no, na nangyari for the period. For each component of equity, a reconciliation between the carrying amount and the beginning and end of the period, separately disclosing changes from profit and loss, each item of the OCI and transactions with owners and their capacity as owners. So that is yung last na line, ito siya, it has something to do with contributions and distributions, no, or mga dividends declarations to the owners. So yun yung first natin na topic, no, about appropriation of retained earnings. And of course, touching also topics na related to statement of changes in equity. So let's now proceed to the second part of this chapter, which is about quasi reorganization. So ano ba itong quasi reorganization? So sabi dito, it is a permissive but not mandatory procedure under which a financially troubled entity restates its accounts and establishes a fresh start in the accounting sense. So this actually is applicable for those companies who are financially distressed, no? So yung mga um, naka-deficit na, no, hindi masyadong maganda yung financial standing ng company. Pag sinabing nag-quasi or they just wanted to have a fresh start in the sense that their financials are not very nice or not very good, no, in the past. So the main goal of this procedure is to eliminate the deficit in your retained earnings. No? Kasi nga, maybe in the past, no, ang daming losses, ganun. Tapos, ayun, of course, pangit tingnan, no, pag merong deficit yung retained earnings ng company. So, this are the circumstances that may justify, quasi reorganization. First, when a large deficit exists. Number two, when approved by the shareholders and creditors. Three, when the cost basics of accounting for PPE becomes unrealistic because here in quasi reor you can revalue, you're allowed to revalue your property, plant, and equipment. So yung example sa ngayon, yung land mo is already or already has a market value of 1 million, yet in your records, it's still 100,000. So parang hindi na papakita kung ano talaga yung true value ng assets mo. So yan, pwede yan, no? It can be a, parang it can be one of your justifications why you will be allowed, no, to have this quasi reorganization. So when a fresh start appears to be desirable and advantageous to all parties na concerned. So just take note lang that quasi reorganization needs to be approved, no, sa Securities and Exchange Commission. Hindi pwedeng basta na lang quasi reor ang isang corporation without having complied yet or hindi siya nakasik ng approval kay SEC. So dapat si SSC na mag-approve muna sa gustong mangyari na quasi reorganization ni corporation. Before the corporation, pwedeng i-apply yung mga gusto niyang gawin, no? Para magkaroon ng fresh start yung corporation niya. So the quasi reorganization is effected through one, recapitalization. So we actually discussed already recapitalization, right? So parang it could be changing the par value, no? Pwede i-increase mo, i-decrease mo, ganun. And then pwede din share split, no? Pwedeng ganun, no? Yung sa recapitalization. Or pwede ring revaluation of PPE, no? Na-revalue natin yung PPE natin para ma-account natin yung amounts na increase, no, sa value ng mga PPE natin. And in that way, parang ma-absorb nun yung deficiency ng ating retained earnings. So for the recapitalization, this refers to the change in the capital structure of an entity brought about by cancellation of the old shares and the issuance of new shares as replacement. So after recapitalization, the total share remains the same because yun na nga, you are just going to transfer one equity account, no, to another equity account. So transfer lang of amounts within equity section. So quasi reorganization, no? So the accounting steps and procedures for accounting or organization are as follows. So first, assets and liabilities are revalued upwards or downwards. So depende yan, no? Depende yan sa evaluation, depende sa mga independent appraisal, no, na gagawin. Dapat approved din ng SEC, no? Or parang convince yung SEC na ito dapat. And that's the reason why we have to hire experts na mga appraisers talaga. Hindi pwedeng yung corporation lang yung mag-evaluate na. Ganito na yung value ng property nito. Hindi. It must be coming from a legit, no, a credible na party involved in assessing or evaluating, appraising, no, mga PPE. Any resulting credit balance in the revaluation surplus is to be used to wipe out the deficit, no? So, yan. Because of that revaluation, no, pag meron tayong revaluation surplus na um, outcome or consequence of that revaluation, then you have to use that to wipe out the deficit. So, you have to close, no, yung deficiency mo. So, in short class, hindi natin i-recognize, no? Wala tayong, kung most probably, parang hindi ka makakapag-recognize ng revaluation surplus. Especially if yung deficiency mo is mas malaki compared sa revaluation surplus na nalikom mo. So, ang mangyayari lang, it will reduce the amount of the deficiency. So, ganun siya. No? So, hindi yung usual na ginagawa natin na yung i-recognize mo yung revaluation surplus. Siguro, may ma-recognize ka ng revaluation surplus that is after wiping out first na your debit or negative balance na retained earnings. Now, if the recapitalization is made, any resulting share premium shall also be used to wipe out the deficit. Na? So, it's in the case naman of yung recapitalization nga, no? Na pag meron kang nalikom na share premium, gamitin mo yun para i-wipe out yung revaluation, yung deficiency natin, yung debit balance ng retained earnings. So we have here an illustration. So this is the statement of financial position of a certain entity prior to a quasi reorganization. So meron siyang current assets na 1 million. Yung PPE niya, ito yung balance, 7.5, accumulated depreciation of 1 million. And then ang net amount niya is 6.5. Total assets is 7.5 million. Liabilities is reported at 4.5. Share capital at 5 million. Then retained earnings deficit niya is 2 million. Di ba, pangit tingnan yung statement of financial position pag merong ganito na retained earnings na naka-negative. So the shareholders and creditors agreed to the following adjustments to accomplish, no, the quasi reorganization. So we have here yung PPE daw ay i-record nila at fair value na 6 million. So parang ito dito, i-report nila at 6 million. No? So you'll have, instead of 6.5, so ma-reduce siya to 6 million. So, ito yung entry natin, no? Debit accumulated depreciation, tanggalin yung accumulated depreciation, and then, dapat tanggalan din ng 1.5 million. So, ang effect nito, mazi-zero out yung accumulated depreciation. And then, yung PPE natin, 7.5 minus 1.5. So, 6 million na lang yung matitira. But then, parang lugi tayo, no? Kasi yung sa record natin, carrying amount natin 6.5, yet gawin na lang 6 million. So, yung parang loss because of the decrease in the value of the PPE, so this one is downward, no, na revaluation, will be charged to retained earnings. So, mas lalo pang lumala yung balance ng retained earnings. Nadagan pa yung deficit natin na 500,000. So, most probably this will become 2.5 na, no, after this entry. So, next would be the inventory is overvalued to the extent of 250,000. So most probably it's in here, no, in the current assets na 1 million. So sobra daw yan ng 250,000, specifically the inventory. So kung overvalued siya, you have to reduce, of course, no? I-debit mo rin siya sa retained earnings and credit inventory account, no, para ma-reflect yung deduction. Kasi overvalued man daw yung inventory. So, yan. And then letter C, the share capital is reduced to 2 million. So, from how much? From 5 million, magiging 2 million na lang. So, yung entry natin, debit tayo ng share capital, 3M, transfer natin sa share premium na 3 million. So, yan. So, most probably, no, parang sa recapitalization, no, yung ating So yung sa ano yung kinuhanan ng um pangtapal no sa ato ang deficit, most probably ang atong deficit ani kay 2 million plus 500, so pila naman na 2.5 no plus 250 pa diri, so 2,750 na tanan ang ato ang negative balance sa retained earnings. So the resulting deficit is charged against the share premium arising from the recapitalization. So yan, dinebit lang kasi nag-recognize tayo ng 3M dito. So most probably, meron pa tayong matitira na 250,000 na share premium. So debit natin lahat, no, yung deficiency or yung deficit or yung negative balance ng retained earnings. And then credit natin sa retained earnings. So ang mangyayari ay yung share premium natin, nakuhaan ng 2,750 million. So, matitira na lang ay 250. Yung retained earnings naman natin na nag-negative kasi nag-credit tayo dito, then mawawala na yung, mag-zero out na siya na wala ng deficiency. So, ito yung magiging itsura ng ating statement of financial position after the Quasi Reorganization. So, yung current assets natin from 1 million because of the reduction of the inventory, no? In the value of the inventory, so maging 750,000 na lang. So since meron tayong downward na revaluation, no? So you have yung PPE natin yung 6 million na lang. So 6,750 yung ating total na assets, no? Yung liabilities ng shareholders equity natin, liabilities for 0.5 million. Yung share capital natin ay 2 million. So, sabi, di ba, yun na lang daw. 20,000 shares na lang daw from 50,000 shares na tag 100 par value. So, yung iba transfer na sa share premium. So, 2M na lang siya. And then lastly, yung share premium mo na natira, no? 3 million minus 2,750 na charge off natin, no? Para ma-wipe out yung deficiency or yung deficit na retained earnings. So, ito yung total natin na liabilities and shareholders equity. So, indeed, it's a fresh start no, for the corporation after this quasi reorg. Kasi yung negative balance ng retained earnings na wipe out. So, mas maganda yung itsura na ng statement of financial position nila compared dun sa bago pa sila nag-reorganize, no? Then we have another illustration here. So this one, it is an entity that sustained heavy losses though over a period of time. And the conditions warrant that the entity should undergo a quasi reorganization at year-end. So the statement of financial position at year-end prior to quasi reorg is, ito siya, no? Current assets niya, 1 million. Yung PPE niya, net amount is 3.5. Meron pa siyang goodwill na 100,000. So yung current liabilities niya, 1.1. Share cap niya, 100 par, so 5 million, share premium niya, 500, retained earnings niya, negative din na 2 million. So ano yung napagkasunduan? So ito yung napagkasunduan nila. Yung PPE daw ay may replacement cost na 9 million. Then yung inventories were written down by 400. So meaning yung 400 yung adjust the amount that you have to reduce, no? So, ito yun na yung adjustment mo, yung 400,000. Dapat ma-reduce ang inventory by 400,000. Goodwill, dapat tanggalin. Then, mag-recognize ng accounts payable amounting to 200,000 and any resulting deficit is charged again the revaluation surplus. So, ito naman, sa valuation naman ito, no? Revaluation of PPE. So, here are the answers to that. So, number 1, adjustment. Determine muna natin kung magkano yung revaluation surplus na makukuha natin from this revaluation. So, we have here the cost is 5 million of the PPE. The accumulated depreciation is 1.5 million. So, yung carrying amount natin is 3.5 as reflected in our statement of financial position. Then, our replacement cost as mentioned is 9 million. So, dito natin siya ilagay kasi hindi pa siya depreciated replacement cost. Hindi rin siya fair value, no? If you can still recall topics, no, sa ato ang revaluation, no? Discussion sa revaluation. And then, what you have to do is, compute natin yung accumulated depreciation. And paano siya kinompute? So, pwede nating computein or kunin yung ratio ng accumulated depreciation sa PPE. So in short, 1.5 divide 5 million times 9 million. No? So yung ratio nito, 1.5 million divide 5 million times 9 million. So you have 2.7. So yung sound value mo or depreciated replacement cost mo is 6.3 million. So with that, no, nakuha natin na ang increase, ang net increase, net appreciation or revaluation surplus is 2.8 million. So you are going to recognize that, na the usual manner that you recognize in a revaluation. So debit tayo ng PPE. So tingnan lang natin yung column na to, no, para sa entries natin. So debit tayo ng PPE, nag-increase siya ng 4 million. Yung accumulated depreciation, dapat mag-recognize din tayo ng 1.2 million and the revaluation surplus is 2.8 million. So, yun yung first natin na adjustment. Second, based on what we have agreed, the inventory daw should be written down by 400,000. So, yan, debit tayo ng retained earnings 400 kasi i-reduce yung asset. So, most probably, marireduce din yung retained earnings. So, inventory should be credited at 400,000. I-write off daw yung goodwill. So, same, debit retained earnings, credit goodwill para ma-zero out siya. And then meron daw unrecorded na accounts payable. So still debit retained earnings and then credit accounts payable, no, to recognize the liability. So before we go to number 5, let's try to determine, no, kung magkano ng balance ng ating retained earnings. So most probably mag-start tayo with negative 2 million. So deficit na 2 million. Tapos dito 400. So 2 million plus 400, that's 2.4 billion na. Plus 100, so that's 2.5 million. Plus 200, so you have 2.7 million na negative balance sa retained earnings natin. So, dapat i-wipe out natin yung negative na retained earnings na 2.7 million doon sa revaluation surplus na na-recognize natin na 2.8. Good thing, meron pang natira, di ba? So, ito yung sinasabi kanina na most probably pag nag-quasi reor, meron lang tayong i-report na revaluation surplus kung may sobra pa, no? After wiping out your deficit balance your retained earnings. So ito 2.7 yung total na deficit, no, negative balance sa the retained earnings. Pero yung ating revaluation surplus ay 2.8. So, dinebit natin ito, ibig sabihin, meron pa tayong matitirang 100,000 na revaluation surplus. So, most probably, yun yung amount na makikita natin sa ating statement of financial position, no, as a balance of your revaluation surplus. Retained earnings natin, because of this entry, mazi-zero out na siya. No? So, zero na siya. Kasi yung negative balance is 2.7, tapos credit tayo ng retained earnings na 2.7. So, ma-offset na yung deficit niya. So, this is how it looks, no? Ito yung maging itsura ng ating statement of financial position after the quasi reor. So, yung current assets natin, naging from 1 million, naging 600,000 na lang kasi nga, nag-decrease daw yung inventory by 400,000. So, ito yung ating PPE, net na niya. So, total assets would be 6.9. Yung current liabilities natin, di ba, nag-recognize tayo ng 200,000 accounts payable. So, from 1.1 plus 200, so meron tayong 1.3 million. Share capital, wala tayong binago dito. Share premium, ganun din, 500, walang nabago dyan. Yung revaluation surplus, 100 na lang. Kasi nga, 2.8 minus 2.7, so meron pang natirang 100,000. And then lastly, yung retained earnings natin na wipe out na, no, na zero out na siya. Kasi close natin, chinarge off natin sa revaluation surplus. So ito na yung itsura ng kanyang statement of financial position after the quasi reor, which is better na compared to that na merong negative balance. Okay? So as I've mentioned, hindi pwedeng i-take effect, no, kung ano mang napag-agrihan ng shareholders saka ng mga lenders na gawin, no, para i-take effect yung quasi reorganization sa isang corporation prior to the approval of the Securities and Exchange Commission. So mag-seek muna ng approval ng SEC before everything will be taken into effect no, sa records ng corporation. So what are the things no, that what are the requirements no, of SEC for quasi reorganization? So number one, so if the quasi reorg is the result of the revaluation of PPE, take note, the revaluation must be made by an independent expert or specialist, no? So, ito yung mina-mention ko earlier na hindi pwedeng magbut-buot ra ang corporation kung pila yung feel, no? Nga values and property. It must be performed. It should be based on a report of an independent expert, no? Usually, mga appraiser yan sila. So, the increase in the value of PP is credited to revaluation surplus, no? That's what we saw in the illustration. And then the adjustments concerning other assets like inventory, investment, and tangibles shall be made through retained earnings. Na tama, kasi hindi mo naman alam na current period yan. No? So most probably, every increases in your assets will affect your retained earnings. No? So kung nag-increase ang asset, meaning credit ang retained earnings. Pero pag nag-decrease ang asset, meaning mag-decrease din yung retained earnings. Kasi nga, if you can still recall, no, the lessons in ACC 111, ang increases in assets also increases equity. So, parang direct yung relationship ng asset sa equity. Pero pag liability, pag nag-increase ang liability, ibig sabihin nun, bababa ang equity na because they have inverse relationship. So, pag tumaas ang liability, debited no yung ating retained earnings kasi yun na nga, nag-increase ng liability will result to a decrease in equity. Whereas pag nag-decrease ng liability, mag-increase naman yung retained earnings. So, i-credit natin yung retained earnings. No? So, I hope you can still recall the relationship, connection, the effect of increases or decreases in your asset or liability to your equity kasi it will still help you na up to now. Number 4, the resulting deficit from the quasi reorganization is offset against the revaluation surplus. So again, ito yung nakita natin in the illustration. And then number 5, the retained earnings subsequent to quasi reorg, take note, shall be restricted to the extent of the deficit wiped out during the reorganization and cannot be declared as dividend. So bawal muna no before hindi mo na mag-declare ng dividends until such time na yung amount is magiging enough na or equivalent na sa wipe out natin na retained earnings. So subsequent losses to quasi or losses subsequent to quasi reorganization cannot be charged anymore to the remaining revaluation surplus. Like for example, yung second illustration, di ba, meron pang natira na 100,000. Like in the next na operation, loss pa rin. So, hindi na natin pwedeng gamitin yung 100,000 pag-offset sa deficit na amount. So, hindi na. And then number 7, the quasi organization shall be disclosed for at least 3 years, no? After nangyari yung quasi or dapat disclose pa rin natin siya sa notes to financial statement that this particular entity, no, made some adjustments to their records no through a quasi reorganization duly approved by SEC. So for at least 3 years yan no para yung mga bagong investors alam nila kung anong history no or ano yung nangyari sa corporation na to kasi possible na okay na yung FS nila no this time pero 3 years back then hindi okay yung company. So, at least aware lang yung investor sa nangyari before. Okay, so that's it. Now, this is the end of this presentation. I hope you learned something from this video. Bye!